Welcome to Sounds of Resistance. With the escalation of the Ukraine-Russian war, the heroic Ukrainian army began to take back the lost lands one by one from the invading Union. Ukrainian President Zelensky's soldiers carried out incredible operations during the 3-month period of the war. The heroic Ukrainian army, which made incredible progress in such a short period of time, put the Russians into a deadlock. February 24, which turned into a black day, a day of mourning for Russian leader Vladimir Putin, was recorded as the date when the Valiant of Ukraine wrote an epic. Keeping its defensive position for a long time in the first days of the war, the Ukrainian fighters started to resist occupation troops day by day. Thanks to the liberation operations prepared by the top generals of the Ukrainian armed forces, the heroic Ukrainian army left the defensive position and moved to the counterattack position. With the liberation operations under the leadership of the Ukrainian President Zelensky, the Ukrainian army took back many homeland occupied by Russian troops. The Ukrainian liberation operation plans, which proceeded from part to wall, primarily ensured the liberation of Ukrainian towns. Small Ukrainian towns which Russia did not care much for in terms of population were among the first to be liberated. But over time, thanks to the support of the Ukrainian local people living in these small towns, which Russia did not care much about, the Ukrainian army gradually turned towards the city centers. Zelensky's soldiers, who took advantage of the comfort in the Russian army, began to take the Russian troops by surprise with the sudden dawn operations they organized. The midnight operations in Ukraine, which did not fall on the world agenda for a long time, caused a fear and panic in the Russian army over time. The Ukrainian advance, which Russian leader Vladimir Putin was also very concerned about, reached its peak after a certain period of time. Now we will examine the sanctions from an operation that these Ukrainian heroes carried out and that swept the world. The heroic Ukrainian army carried out such an operation that the whole world watched these Ukrainian fighters in amazement. On a cool Kharkiv morning, the KRAKEN special forces of Ukrainian heroes, infiltrating the fronts of the occupying troops, arrived in the city of Balaklia before the day was fully lighted. The heroic Ukrainian soldiers, who were divided into groups in this region, continued their advance towards the depths of the city. Trapping Russian troops in the city of Balaklia, Ukrainian KRAKEN special operation units began to push Russian forces towards the city's border after a long engagement. Then the Russian troops, devastated by the successful shootings of the Ukrainian HIMARS artillery units, had to flee, leaving their military equipment in the conflict area. The attacks of the heroic Ukrainian army continued in full force until the Russian troops left Balaklia. After the epic Balaklia victory, the President of Ukraine, Zelensky, shared a video on his social media account of Ukrainian soldiers flying the glorious Ukrainian flag from the roof of the Balaklia government building. Saint Ukrainian soldiers in the image shared by Zelensky expressed the words, "Dear President, Commander-in-Chief, Balaklia has been taken under control, the instruction has been fulfilled," and waved the Ukrainian flag from the roof of the government building. The Russian army units, which suffered a great loss in the face of the Balaklia victory, continued their search for a safe zone. The invading troops, who could hardly get themselves out of Balaklia, began to advance towards the eastern border of the city. Russian leader Vladimir Putin remained silent about this crushing defeat by the Russian army. The Kremlin administration did not make any statements for a long time. While the Russian administration is only covering up the progress of the Ukrainian heroes, the Ukrainian government has stated that the operations will continue until the invading troops are completely cleared from Ukraine. After a long time, Vladimir Putin was the first to break his silence. The Russian leader, who did not mention the Balaklia disaster, made interesting statements in the face of Ukraine's overwhelming superiority. Vladimir Putin emphasized that the Russian army is currently maintaining a cautious retreat position and is gathering for major offensive plans in the future. Although the Russian leader refers to mobilization in this regard, the mobilization announced throughout Russia has not had much impact on the Ukraine-Russia war so far. With the loss of soldiers of the Russian army exceeding a terrible figure of 60,000 since the beginning of the war on February 24, Vladimir Putin declared mobilization throughout Russia. The mobilization decision, which aimed to heal the wounds of the deep defeats of Russians, brought much more casualties to the Russian army. When we look closely at the situation, most of the soldiers in the Russian army did not want to fight anyway. The turmoil in the army, communication breakdowns and arguments were destroying the morale of the Russian soldiers. On top of that, when the Ukrainian heroes' victory in Balaklia was added to this, the hopes of the Russian army against the war were exhausted. Russian local people also wanted the ongoing war in Ukraine to stop. For this reason, Russian citizens who opposed the mobilization announced in Russia began to separate from their leader Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin's declaration of mobilization across the country, which dragged Russia into chaos, drove Russian citizens mad with anger. Russian locals protested for days against Vladimir Putin and mobilization. The protest demonstrations, attended by thousands of Russian citizens, caused quite a stir in Russia. Leader Vladimir Putin issued an arrest warrant for Russian citizens who participated in these protests. This approach of the Russian leader both distanced himself from his people and laid the groundwork for the establishment of an empire of oppression throughout Russia. Because no one in Russia wanted to go to Ukraine and die. With the mobilization decision of the Russian Minister of Defense, the efforts to recruit volunteers from the Russian army turned into a manhunt. Russian Guard regiments were roaming the streets of Russia, detaining all the people they saw to send them to war. And even the manhunt carried out by the Russian Guard regiments, which caused many scandals, was met with reaction from many countries of the world. With the mobilization decision, thousands of sick and elderly Russian citizens were included in the Russian army. Even though the news of this scandal was approved by Russian Defense Ministry, a statement was issued by the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu to correct the mistakes. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu stated that recruitment practices could lead to confusion as the process progresses very quickly. However, Shoigu, who stated that these confusions would be corrected immediately, was trying to relieve the Russian people, because due to the mobilization decision announced in Russia, thousands of Russian citizens had to leave their country, no longer able to withstand further losses. The Russian Defense Ministry did not take any action after Shoigu's statements that the wrongs would be corrected. On the contrary, the clause in the mobilization decree that full-time Russian students would not be included in the volunteer soldiers was violated. Russian Guard regiments recently raided all universities across Russia and mobilized thousands of Russian university students to Russian military assembly centers. This scandal was also covered up. These violations of the Russian administration were not enough, and the Russian Federal Republics with minorities were also used for mobilization. Russian Guard regiments mobilized citizens from many Russian minority republics, especially Dagestan, to fight in Ukraine. Now we all think this. How true is that Russian citizens, thousands of people in the minority republic, Russian university students, all these people were forced by the Russian administration to be sent to Ukraine to fight? When will this oppression and fear regime of the Russian administration, which is tired of committing crimes against humanity and war violations, end? We will see the developments together. Don't forget to follow our channel. Stay cool for now.